Hey, this is Jacob Evan. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, I want to go into a particular Hebrew word which is sometimes translated as soul. And you may see that some of the time whenever this word is used, the surrendering of soul, and then in other times it may not appear that way at all. And just relying on an English translation would not make that apparent. We're going to look at this word in question, this Hebrew word nephesh, and I want us to consider whether soul is maybe not a fully accurate translation. And this gets into two issues which come up regarding going from Hebrew into a translation. And these are kind of obvious, but it can be easy to lose sight of those at some times. And number one would be that whenever we're going from one language to another, rarely is there an exact replacement word that carries exactly the same category of meaning to it. So whenever we're going from Hebrew to English, there's probably not going to be an English word that captures the entirety of the meaning of the Hebrew word. And what translations tend to do when it comes to this is they will use multiple different English words for the same Hebrew word. And sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that if our primary focus in our study is looking at a translation, and we may look at one word in one place, one English word in one place, and gather certain ideas about it based on that English word. And sometimes I know people might refer heavily to a English dictionary even to understand it, when in reality we may be looking at another word in another location and it's actually the same Hebrew word. It may be two different English words used for the same Hebrew word. And the flip side of that is also true in that sometimes the meaning of the English word will go beyond the meaning of the Hebrew word. And I don't necessarily blame translators for this. Most of the time whenever it's done, I assume that it is just done to try to make the best of the situation, although obviously there is a potential to kind of work in certain ideas that may or may not be there, whether that is intentional or whether it's subconscious or whether it's just not intended at all. And this might get into the question of what should we be gathering from what we're reading? If a person were to be reading or focusing or reading solely in English translation, and of course, obviously that's not the ideal situation, but that's the situation where many are at, and it's understandable. So in that situation, what should a person be gathering from the text? Because if we're acknowledging this situation that translation is not going to be perfect, that the categories of meaning are not exactly the same, and if we're acknowledging that we can't look at an individual English word and then assume that every single time that English word appears that it's even the same Hebrew word, because sometimes it's not. And then we also are acknowledging that sometimes whenever these Hebrew words appear, they're translated differently in different situations. And in this situation, talking about something that's an abstract concept in some sense, something that's not like it's a physical object necessarily, the idea of a soul, we might be wondering, well, what should we be gathering from it? Because all of these English ideas, or all of these ideas that have been brought into the language, into the English language, and grouped into that word of soul, there is a question of, well, how relevant is all that information to our reading of the Hebrew text, or our reading of a translation of the Hebrew text? And that gets into my second point, which has already been alluded to, which is that if English is our native language, which it is for me, English is my native language, the language that I grew up with, and it's the language that I speak to people with, considering that, there are all sorts of experiences and background information that's already in my brain that's associated with, in this case, for example, the word soul. And naturally, that is all going to be brought up, whether it's intended or not, whether the translator intended it, or, of course, whether that is intended by the Hebrew text or the Hebrew word. And that can further complicate things even beyond what would be apparent, because sometimes all of that background information that we have can be tied to other things, like tied to other beliefs, or those things can be tied to certain emotions. And so those ideas might naturally predispose a person to look at the text a certain way or to understand a translation in a certain way. Of course, none of us would necessarily be inclined to do something like this, but it's very easy for other people, whenever they're looking at something like this, to latch on to some very minor point and let that distract them from everything else, all the other relevant information about the word. It's very easy for other people to come across something and say, well, that just doesn't fit with my belief, and then it doesn't even matter what the information is or what the reality is. But when it comes to seeking the truth, if we're wanting to understand the text for what it says, if we're wanting to seek the meaning of what these words would be from that time, and seeking to return to his ways, seeking to understand what truth is, then obviously that's going to require us to seek things on a deeper level. And part of my understanding of that would be to not focus on English words, English phrases, English concepts, because even though that's easy to do if that's our native language, even though that would be easy to accidentally drift into as we're thinking about these things, because most of us are probably thinking in English or some language other than ancient Hebrew, it's natural to drift into thinking about things in those other terms. But instead, what I think we should be doing is working to focus on Hebrew words, Hebrew concepts, especially when we're dealing with the Hebrew text, because that is likely closer to how they would have understood the text, and that is likely going to get us closer to understanding what it is that God, what it is that Elohim wants from us. So those are two things which I think are worth acknowledging as we go into this, or really as we go into almost any issue of studying Scripture, studying the Hebrew text, because ancient Hebrew is not subject to any kind of English idea. It's a much later thing than what we're looking at here. So one of the general frames that might come up, or the questions that might arise in studying this word, would be, what does the Torah say about a soul? Or does the Torah discuss anything related to any kind of concept of a soul? And that is one of the things that I want to get into as we're looking at this. And I want to start by looking at the different categories or the scope of the meaning for this word, because there are many ways that this word is used beyond what would be translated as soul typically in most English translations. There are many ways in the Hebrew text that it is used that go beyond those examples. There are other times whenever the Hebrew word is not rendered that way, and there are other times whenever the word is essentially not rendered at all. It doesn't even have an apparent translation for that word in a given passage at times. So as we're looking at the different ways that this Hebrew word is used in the text, we will note that there are some ways that the meaning is not really relevant to any kind of discussion of any kind of concept of soul. But I think it's important that we recognize the fullness of the scope of meaning as much as we can, because it does bear relevance in how we understand the word. One of those meanings, which I think is kind of an obscured or otherwise overlooked, is one of the more literal meanings, as I would understand it, which is the throat or the neck. At times, the word is used to refer to the throat of the body, and this also extends into similar words that appear in other Semitic languages that appear to be correlated with this word, the meaning of throat or neck. That is not the primary way that we see the word used in the Torah, but there are some examples which do appear to be there. And in looking at this, I'm going to go into different examples that appear across the Hebrew Bible. My tendency would be to emphasize the Torah, emphasize the books of the commands, but some of these different aspects of the meaning of the word don't always appear, or don't appear very often in the Torah, and so I'm going to extend that out into other books. We see in Numbers 11:6, "And now our throat is dry. There is nothing at all before our eyes except for the manna." That is not the normal way this is translated, this throat example, but I think you will soon see why I have that understanding for it now. Proverbs 25:25. "Cold water on a parched throat is like a good report from a distant land." Isaiah 5:14. "And Sheol widens its throat, and it opens its mouth." Here we have throat again, and sometimes that's rendered something like desire or appetite and such, and that is a possibility for many of these examples, of course. although I would recognize that it's in parallel with opening its mouth, and so it would appear to me that that would carry a similar meaning if we took it in a more literal sense, at least as far as how it is being translated. Isaiah 29:8, like the hungry one shall dream, and behold, eating, and he is waking, and his throat is empty. And there are a number of examples like this, like in Isaiah 32:6, to empty the throat of the hungry, and he is depriving the drink of the thirsty. And this one is a little more questionable in a way. I think it's a possibility, and I want to recognize it since it is a command. In Leviticus 16:29, in reference to the Day of Atonement or the Day of Covering, Yom Kippurim, in the 10th of the month you shall afflict your throats. And there are other examples like this that you can check out which appear to refer to fasting, and that seems to be an obvious implication at times whenever it uses this phrasing. And so one more literal way of understanding it might be to afflict your throats. And of course there may be the idea of desire and so forth, and we'll talk about that shortly as another possibility. But I wanted to recognize this as a possibility since we're talking about the more literal meaning of throat. Those are some examples of nephesh being used in a way that could be understood as throat. And there are a few other examples which also could imply either throat or neck. For example, in Psalm 69 verse 2 or verse 1, depending on your numbering system, there is, "Save me, Elohim, for water comes unto the neck." Of course, throat could be applicable there as well. This is an example you see a number of times in the text, and we're going to see another one of those shortly. In Psalm 105:18, we have, "They afflicted his foot in the fetter, his neck entered into iron." So this might be understood as someone being bound and literally having the neck being bound here. And then, as alluded to in Jonah 2:6, "Waters enveloped me unto the neck. Abyss surrounded me, reed wrapped my head." So we have examples of throat and we have examples of neck. In the Torah, though, that is not the normal way the word is used. It's not the most frequent way it is used, which is simply in reference to a person. We can see that in Leviticus 7:25, for example, in reference to being cut off from its people. So in this case, the one eating the fat from animals which are sacrificed, or of the type of animals which are sacrificed, one eating the fat is cut off. And this is a frequent wording that we see in the text. The being and that being shall be cut from its people. That is one of the most common phrases where nephesh appears in the Torah, in the commands. And even going outside of phrases which are similar to that in the Torah, we have examples like Leviticus 17:12, "Any being from you shall not eat blood," with being, once again, being nephesh. So there are a lot of examples that just appear to mean a human, at least as far as how it is being used. And to be clear, whenever I'm using the word being here, I don't mean it in the English sense of a thing that is. I'm using it just as a unique word because it's not just used for people, it's also used for animals. We can see this example in Leviticus 11:10, where it says, "And from all of the living being which is in the waters." So we have examples where it means humans, and we have examples where it refers to animals. So one way of looking at how this word nephesh is being used is that we have examples where it's referring to things which are living, and we also have examples where it's used to refer to things which were formerly living. For example, Numbers 6:6, it refers to the Nazir, the Nazirite, not being allowed to approach a dead nephesh. So a dead soul or a dead being or a dead body is not being approached by the Nazir. And there are many other times where the word is used this way, where it is either paired with the word for dead or dying, or that is at least inferable based on the context that we see it in. It doesn't always have the attached word for dying in passages where it's referring to a dead body or apparently referring to a dead body. And one example, at least as far as how it is commonly understood, one example that you might be aware of this appears in Leviticus 19:28 in the midst of the passage about different commands regarding a person's body. And at the beginning of verse 28, we have the cutting for a nephesh. We have, you shall not give cutting for a nephesh in your flesh. So normally that's understood as the dead, although that is not explicit in this verse. Some people categorize these 4 commands as talking about rituals for mourning. Some people categorize these 4 commands as talking about things which are being done to the body or being done to modify the body in some form. And when delving into this one specific command, some people would understand this nephesh as being the dead and being cutting done to mourn the dead, and then others understand it as cuttings being done to protect against the dead or other things as well. The main reason I wanted to show this is to provide an example that many of us are probably going to already be aware of, but may not be aware of the fact that the word nephesh appears here because it's normally just translated as the dead here. Now, what do we have so far? We have nephesh being used as the throat, and we have potentially the neck, and also we have examples of a being, whether it be examples of a human, and we have examples of an animal, and we might look at that as examples of living things, and we also saw there are examples of things which were once living. We have examples of dead bodies in some sense. And now I want us to consider another aspect to the meaning of this word nephesh as personality or emotion or desire or mentality. And we can see Leviticus 16:29, this is one we looked at earlier regarding Yom Kippurim. In the 10th of the month you shall humble your beings. And this, of course, is a more traditional rendering of it, a more traditional understanding of it. Humbling your beings, humbling your souls, or afflicting your souls. I wanted to bring this up again because of what I said earlier regarding the throat. It's not necessarily the literal throat, and in fact, depending on how you look at this, one could take it as referring to general humbling of one's mentality, humbling of one's desires, and not pursuing that overall, rather than just the idea of abstaining from food or abstaining from food and drink. And I wanted to bring that possibility in here. I recognize that both could be understood from this, and I just wanted to make us aware of that. Now in Leviticus 26:11 we have, "And I will give my tabernacle in your midst, and my being shall not hate you." And this is in the context of the blessings of the people following the Torah. And one of those blessings is that the tabernacle will be given in your midst. Of course, we have the Mishkan, the tabernacle, referred to very frequently throughout the commands of the Torah, even though sometimes it's just kind of overlooked or not acknowledged because it's perceived as not relevant anymore, even though the majority of the commands in the Torah, which are referred to as being for your generations, as being for olam, which might be understood as forever or perpetually or from now on, even though those commands most frequently are associated with the tabernacle and with the tabernacle rituals, sometimes it is not really given much attention, or sometimes it's not really considered to be important, even though clearly it is a major part of the Torah. We have this very clear example of a blessing of following the Torah, one of the blessings being the tabernacle is being given in your midst. And next to that, in that same verse, we have, "And my being shall not hate you." So we have nephesh once again, and potentially this could be understood as going beyond just referring to myself, just referring to, in this verse, the person speaking being Elohim. It could be understood as thought, desire, emotion, inclination, etc. Likewise, a few verses later, we have Leviticus 26:15 talking about the curses of rejecting the Torah. And so we have, if your being shall detest my judgments to not do all of my orders. So we have nephesh being used here, presumably in a similar way to what we saw in the last verse. And also we have in Deuteronomy 13, verse 4 or verse 3, this is in reference to the issue of false prophets, the issue of a prophet coming and maybe he performs a sign or a wonder, and maybe it seems to come to pass, and it says that regardless of that, depending on what the person is saying, that you're not supposed to listen to that person. And it says that this could be a test to know whether you're truly loving him, a test to know, are you loving him? And it says, in all of your heart and in all of your nephesh. And there are some other similar examples of nephesh being used in the same way, and we might compare that with some of the examples that we just saw. We could see this as maybe inner inclination or something of that sort. And as one final example in this regard, we have in Genesis 27:19, eat from my game so that your being shall bless me. Now that we've considered the usage of this word across a variety of contexts, we can start to consider uses of the word that may be more directly relevant to the translation of soul, or that idea that has been associated with soul. And this general aspect of the word, as I would see it, would be connected with the breath and with life. With regard to breath, we can see that connected with the root verb for nephesh. And with some of these examples we're about to look at, some of them you may see as maybe fitting both breath and life, just depending on how you're looking at the meaning of it. Starting with Job 41, verse 13 or verse 21, his breath ignites embers and fire goes forth from his mouth. So we have breath as being the apparent, most clear meaning for this. And then as we go into Genesis 1:30, we see, for every moving thing on the land, which in it is a living breath. We have one of the Hebrew words for life here being applied alongside this word, nephesh, and so I have interpreted it as breath, although you may be able to see it another way. Getting into probably the most relevant verses in the Torah regarding this notion of life or regarding this notion of soul, we might look to Leviticus 17:11. And you'll probably want to check the surrounding verses for this because it is discussed beyond this verse, but I'm going to focus on this one for right now. For the life of the flesh, it is in the blood, and I give it to you over the altar to cover over your lives. For the blood, it is covering in the life. We have multiple uses of nephesh here. We have the life of the flesh, or nephesh of the flesh, and we have referring to covering over or atoning for your lives, and we have that reiterated, it is covering in the life. And there is a corollary passage in Deuteronomy 12:23, but be firm and not eating the blood, for the blood, it is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. So we have nephesh being used twice here. It is the life, or it is the nephesh, and you shall not eat the nephesh with the flesh. Toward the beginning of the video, I posed this possible question of, what does the Torah say regarding any ideas that might be related to what we would call the soul now, or what we might think of in relation to a soul, at least in English terms? What would be comparable in Hebrew, or if there is something comparable to it? And I pointed out that nephesh is the commonly translated word in Hebrew that's translated into soul. And in these two passages here, these are, in my view, the primary passages that discuss any subject of that notion, at least in the Torah itself, at least in the commandments. We have some details here which are relevant in how we look at this, because in Leviticus 17:11, we have it saying that it is in the blood, that the nephesh is in the blood. And in Deuteronomy 12:23, we have it referring to the blood. It apparently says that It is the Nephesh. The blood is the Nephesh. And I want to point out here that this is, which is used in both of these verses and has probably appeared in some of the preceding verses, that it is a word which is inserted in here, which is why I've italicized it. It is inserted into the translation. It does not represent a word which is used in the verse, but based upon the way that the Hebrew syntax works, at least many of the times, that would be inferred, at least when we're looking at it in English terms. So the most obvious indication between these two verses is that the Nephesh of the flesh, is a constituent of the blood in some sense. Taking a Torah-focused view on these matters, I think these are the most clear indications regarding this, and I cannot really elaborate much more on that just from my personal understanding of it, because that is where I am trying to place my focus and place my attention. And although maybe I could bring in some outside ideas just as far as my own personal opinion is concerned, or my own personal hypotheses would be concerned, I don't want to do that because I want to focus on the text here, and I want to leave this as the key explanation in the Torah. What I might say is that we could derive a meaning of something similar to life or life force in these contexts based upon this, but other implications are not apparent, and this appears to hint at a more physical nature to things. If we were to expand the source material out to a broader extent, like expanding it out into the Pentateuch at large, in Genesis, there are some references to life that may overlap with breath and with breath of life, and if we're thinking about it in this more abstract sense, we might look to something like Genesis 1:30, or, for example, in Genesis 35:18, regarding Nephesh going forth from Rachel or Rachel, because it says, "for she died." And if we're looking at this may be seen as opening enough of a gap to fill with different beliefs about soul, although it appears very similar to me to Psalm 146, verse 4. And in this verse, it uses ruach instead of nephesh regarding death and either one's plans or thoughts being destroyed because of it. Of course, this is just a psalm, and it's not even framed as being prophetic or from God. And Genesis is not any different in that respect, but I wanted to bring that out because there is a clear difference between the Torah, which is oftentimes framed as being things which are quotes from God, quotes from Elohim, whereas there are other passages which are included in the Hebrew Bible which either they're narrative or they're just people's opinions on things. And so that's something to, I think, make a distinction between, because clearly when we're talking about something that's supposed to be a quote from Elohim, it is going to be treated differently from just someone talking, in my view. So getting back to these two verses, we could see these as things that are being said or things that are being described by people, although in my view it's not very explicit as to what is being indicated, and also it does not carry as much weight as these passages we looked at from Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12 regarding the blood. Since I mentioned the ruach, this is something which is sometimes emphasized in certain beliefs. This is a word which tends to be well known for certain reasons, and this might be seen as maybe filling some of the gaps in that belief regarding soul and spirit, as ruach does imply spirit in some sense at times. But this is still lacking as far as constructing any type of explanation for a soul which is from the Torah or from the Pentateuch. In my thinking, the closest thing that I'm aware of as far as this subject matter of the soul or ideas that might be related to it, as far as that is concerned, is a statement in Genesis 4:10 regarding the blood of Abel or blood of Abel crying out to Elohim from the ground, and ground in this case is Adamah. This obviously could be metaphoric in some sense, but the exact degree of what is metaphoric could be questioned. We might connect it to Leviticus 17:11 or Deuteronomy 12:23 regarding the blood, and to Numbers 16:30, which talks about Adamah opening its mouth and causing people to descend toward Sheol. And I would point out that Sheol does seem to imply something beyond the grave alone, at least in some contexts, and I would point to Deuteronomy 32:22 regarding that. When it comes to non-Torah and non-Pentateuch sources, such as passages in the Nook or the latter parts of the Tanakh, there are verses which could be considered as a much stronger support for that particular view, such as Daniel 12:2. When it comes to this issue, in my opinion, this simply does not appear to be the emphasis of the Torah, simply put. Most of the Torah seems to be about doing, and about what to do now, and about what Elohim will do and what we will do in response. And it seems to be about setting out what is good and right and what is wrong and evil. That, of course, leaves it to the person to wonder about the exact reason for certain things not being discussed, whether that be because certain things should not be the focus, or whether certain things are not discussed simply because they don't work in the way that people have assumed, or maybe they just didn't need to be discussed, or maybe there's some other reason or combination of reasons that we may not ever be privileged to know. That's one thing about assuming reasons regarding the text or assuming reasons regarding commands, is that if it doesn't say it, we don't know it. The closest semblance to an overt discussion of this subject goes back to those two passages in Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12. So what have we looked at regarding Nephesh? We've looked at its usage as the throat or as the neck, and we also looked at it as being used for a human or a being, and being used as an animal even. We also looked at it for a previously living being, for a dead person or a dead body. We also looked at the breath and life and breath, and by extension maybe life force or something like that, although that is not 100% clear. And we also looked at Nephesh as being the personality or inner thought or emotion or mentality or disposition or desire of the person. These are the meanings that we looked at, these are the contexts that we looked at, and these are the ways that the word appears to be used throughout the Hebrew text. I think it is far more useful to think about things from this angle, from, as much as we can at least, returning to the ancient Hebrew ways of looking at things. And of course, this is easier said than done. It is very distant. It's not the same, not exactly the same as modern Hebrew, but it remains very relevant if we want to seek the truth, if we want to understand what it is that the Torah says, and if we want to look at things as closely as we can from a closer perspective to the original way of looking at it. The Hebrew text of the Torah is not subject to any kind of English idea. So seeking to understand the text, seeking to understand the meaning of the Hebrew words through the ways that they are used, the ways that they were used, is very relevant in returning to his ways. Thanks for watching. Stay focused and be tenacious.